So we're practicing reducing our suffering. Really, it's a big part. It's really one way of capturing what we're trying to do here. That's a sort of negative way of phrasing it. But that's okay. I mean, that sort of is one way of attacking it. I mean, we're practicing acceptance, which leads to less suffering. Is another way of putting it. But sometimes it's useful to focus on the types of suffering, or what is the structure of your particular unique suffering. So all suffering has this basic structure, which is you're having an experience right now in the present moment. You don't want to be having that experience. And therefore you suffer from it. You're resisting it in some ways. You fight it in some way. Now, that's the basic structure, but there's lots of ways that can look. So for instance, I might be like, I really want $1 million and I don't have $1 million. So what you're suffering from there is an imagined experience you're having, and an experience of comparing where you are now to some other state, right? You don't like this comparison. So you're suffering from the imagined comparison. It's happening in the present moment. It's an experience in the present moment. It is something you're resisting and don't want to change. But the experience itself is sort of like partly in the future and partly just an idea. That's an example. So we could be, that's the kind of suffering that's the compare and despair type of suffering, right? Comparing to your future, comparing to somebody else. What you've done is you've taken your present state and then you're devaluing it. You're saying this state is not as good as a state I would be in other ways. Or you might be suffering from the fact something happened to you in the past you can't get over. And so you're bringing up memories and repeated stories about that time. So something happened, you see it happening again. That would be prototypical trauma kind of response. You're actually visually experiencing it, or you're physically experiencing the experience again. Or you could just be telling yourself, I can't believe that happened to me. It's so unfair that happened to me. So again, in a sense, you're suffering from the past, but the only way you can suffer from the past is in the present moment. So you're having a present moment experience. You might call a memory, or it might just be a story of your life, and you don't like it. You don't want to be having it. You're resisting it, and it causes suffering. So the prototypical example of suffering is you're feeling pain right now and you don't want the pain. And so you're suffering from the pain. You're struggling with the pain, right? Because that's so present and obvious. But it's important to notice that other types of suffering are also their present moment experiences. In a way, you can think of them all as a type of pain that you're resisting. This is where Eckhart Tolle sort of comes up with the pain body idea, right? The idea that if you're suffering in the present moment, you're in contact with a body that's in pain. This is only useful in the sense that it reminds you that if you're suffering right now, it's because there's a present moment experience that you're fighting with. Even if that present moment experience is made up of mind talk about the future or the past. This is why mindfulness can cut through so much suffering so quickly if you really, really practice it, because you'll start to see that if you're feeling pain in your leg, there may be nothing you can do about it. Who knows what caused it, right? There may be nothing, you just have to feel it and suffer from it. In mindfulness, we can come to some acceptance with it, but you can't get rid of it, right? But if you can see through your mind, then many of the stories that cause your suffering can just evaporate. So if you're sitting here suffering right now because of something that happened 20 years ago, that's a mind-generated suffering. I mean, it's the object of your suffering is mind-generated. It's a story or a memory. Doesn't mean it's not compelling and hard to see through, but it has a different quality than if someone's putting a hot poker to your leg, right? So I want to talk about a particular type of suffering that I suspect most people have felt at some point in your life, maybe some to more extreme degrees than others. And that's a suffering that might be called the sort of feeling trapped or constrained. I want to talk about the suffering because it's often a part of depression. It's a part of some of the more extreme forms of despair. If you can start working with something like this in a mindful way, you're going to be able to you're going to have a lot of ability to work with other types of suffering that arise. Right. So when you're depressed, there seems like nothing will ever be good again, and there doesn't seem to be a way out of it. So that's a characteristic most people describe of depression. If you never had depression, then that's great, awesome. But lots of people have. Or despair. When you have despair, there's sort of a lack of hope. There seems to be no way forward. There can also be a literal trapped feeling about your life. There can be sort of a whole set of circumstances that make up your life that just seem to be repeatedly bringing you back into the same experiences you don't enjoy, and you can't find a way out of them. Most of us have had that at some point in our life. It's like, oh, how have I gotten myself here? Right? I keep having the same experience, and I can't. The way out seems so onerous, or it seems like requiring to like go get a whole new life, which might seem impossible. I'm just sort of describing this trapped feeling. You can sort of think about the different ways you might have had that experience. They can be very short-term experiences, very short-term experience of being trapped, which is great because then you get out of it soon and you can see you were wrong. They can be long-term ones. Some people feel trapped in this life, the whole life they feel trapped, right? Now, this is not a fun place to be. So trust me, I have extreme compassion if you're feeling this now, or if you've ever felt this. But as I said, it's a real opportunity, because if you can sort of work with this experience, then you can work with most experiences. The only other variable that would make something harder is the intensity of it. So you could have a very intense, painful experience, And you could have a very dull trapped experience that could still be really miserable, right? So some trapped experiences are dull, but still it takes a lot to work with them to figure out. They're not, it's not just a vague feeling of trappedness, right? So there's a vague feeling of suffering all the time. Still very challenging to work with. If you could work with that, you could work with most things. The only other thing, as I said, would be some very intense, painful experience. That requires a different kind of presence. So I'm a very optimistic, kind of hopeful person. So it goes against my grain to talk this way, because I do find it important to inspire people or give people a sense of hope when they're doing their practice. Most of us need that to keep developing, to keep going forward. But there is a big part of practice, which is ultimately the experience of abandoning hope. And that sounds pretty negative. Obviously, it sounds pretty negative. But, and Obama wouldn't approve, but what is hope really? Hope is a condition of saying right now isn't really good enough, but I'm hopeful it'll be better in the future. And again, that's very useful in life. It's a useful kind of attitude to be able to have. But it does perpetuate a pattern of non-acceptance. So if you find yourself in life in a trapped experience, there's lots of ways to work with it, and I'll talk about some more. But the core thing to face there is, can I accept this feeling of hopelessness? Because in many ways, that's the core suffering in a trapped experience. And hopelessness sounds very, very dramatic, but you can tone that down just to feeling defeated, feeling incapable or incompetent of mastering whatever it is you're trying to master. There's lots of other ways that the core experience of being trapped is a experience of not having hope that you can get through it or get out of it. And what is a feeling of hopelessness like in the body and the mind? So the thing is, if you can really, really embrace hopelessness in the body and the mind, you'll find a real freedom. Because if you really embrace hopelessness, if you accept that, then the struggling ends. This is very, very, if you just do this without any practice in your life, you might get a taste of it, but it won't last very long, because our habit of mind to start struggling and is too strong. So if you have to encounter hopelessness without too much practice, you can get a taste of it for a second, but it'll either lead you to feeling suicidal, or you'll get popped right out of it again because you'll start struggling right away. So with practice, what we want to do is just be present with the actual experience of the core of the trapped feeling. The truth is, you're not hopeless. That's just the truth. The truth is that we know that every experience changes. There's impermanence is a deep feature of human experience. So there's no way you're actually trapped. But nonetheless, to really face this kind of suffering, you have to accept that at the core there is a feeling of hopelessness that you're fighting against, because that seems like the worst thing possible, right? So you're like, I can't be hopeless. There has to be some hope. There has to be this chance or that opportunity. There has to be a way out of this. So you keep looking everywhere. And the trap feeling is everywhere you look is bad. But when you look and you see there's no door there, you look again to that wall and there's still no door there. But you look back, maybe there'll be a door there now, right? Nope, there's no door now. And look back, oh, you keep looking around the room and it's just a closed room. The energy of struggle is so powerful that we'll keep doing that. So imagine a room with no doors. You would just keep looking, right? For a good long time. Steel room, no doors. How long do you think you'd be looking? Months, probably, for the most average person. Because what are you doing? You're avoiding the feeling of hopelessness that is rising in your body. I do not want to feel that hopelessness for even a second because it's so painful. So what do we learn here in mindfulness and in mindful awakening? Is to lean into the thing we're resisting. That is to turn towards that which we don't want to look at. That which we don't want to look at governs our life. This is such a good example of that. And really, I think this really in some ways boils down the essence of the human suffering. You're in a steel room, there's no doors, there's no seams. How long do you keep looking for a door? When do you turn towards the feeling of there's no way out? Because that feeling of there being no way out is only made of feel, image, talk. It's a sensation in the body. It's sounds in the head. It's pictures in the head. And the second you are able to accept all those feelings in the body, sounds in the head, and pictures in the head, you actually are free. There's a amazing book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Probably most of you have heard of it or read it. About being in a concentration camp in World War II and trying to have a life. Like, what do you do? How do you live? And there are lots of strategies and things, but in the way we're approaching it here, the first thing you have to do or the most fundamental thing you could do, is to look directly at that which you're most scared of. It could be death, right? That could be what you're in. It could be just death. That's very close to hopelessness. Or it could be this sense of hopelessness. Because the truth is, we are all in a certain prison. We can't fly, right? We're all constrained. We're all stuck on Earth. Probably none of us are going to get off Earth in this lifetime. Maybe a couple of us, but most of us aren't. We have a finite space within which we are going to operate for a finite amount of time. And so the question is, can we turn to that finite space and accept and love it? Because that's it is what we've been given. When you're depressed, that's exactly the feeling, is you feel trapped in the world. That is, you can imagine moving anywhere. You're not in a steel room. You could imagine going anywhere, and you're just like, there's nothing, nowhere would give me anything, right? So the whole world seems like that experience of being in a steel room. So we've been talking about emotion a lot the last few weeks. So here in this center, we would start to work with probably some intense fear, and then some intense grief underneath that. The trapped feeling, I think you can see how fear would be pretty near the surface of that. And if you've been told you shouldn't be scared, or you shouldn't show fear, especially if you're a man in this culture, but obviously it's universal that we are supposed to suppress our emotions to a degree, then that fear will be really hard for you to look at and accept. And we did a class a few weeks ago on fear, so that would be a way to begin working with this. If you feel trapped, you probably are feeling fear. You may not feel like that at first, but you can look and you say, oh yeah, I'm scared. And then underneath that is often an intense grief for what you think you've lost. When you face that fear, you'll see through the story of the fear, whatever it is. So the key element of a fear like that is going to be something, and this is really deep. It's important to key element of that kind of fear is going to be life is not worth living without X. This is a very important statement or principle that's inside of you. You have a set of narratives about what makes life worth living, makes life good. Again, it doesn't, I mean, we're not having to put it that dramatically, right? And when we feel trapped, we have a fear we're never going to get that thing that we've said what makes life worth living. So this could be very deep, and it can be really hard to see through. Again, imagine being trapped in a steel room. Boy, it feels like nothing worth living is going to be left, right? But the nature of aging and getting old and death is that everything that you think makes life worth living in the experiential world will at some point not be available to you, probably. Not in the experiential world. So we can avoid it for most of our life, but most of us will end up having to face this question. If I don't get the right experiences, what's the point, right? Don't worry, I know I've taken us to a dark place here, but we'll keep pushing through. What I want you to know is that there is a freedom from this kind of suffering. Because there's a freedom from that thought that life requires X. Happiness requires X. What we're practicing in mindfulness, we're practicing in this whole path, is a kind of unconditional happiness. The Buddha practiced his whole life. It's not a Buddhist class, but it's a good story. The Buddha practiced his whole life, all these practices, all these skills, all these abilities, and he realized at a certain point that he wasn't there. He didn't have unconditional happiness. He was calm and masterful and educated and wise. And he said, okay, I have to have this. So I'm sitting down under this tree and I'm not getting up until I have it. And what happened mythically is obviously a somewhat mythical story, but for those of us who continue on this path, you'll see that it's pretty much a literal description of what happens, usually not in one night. But the most terrifying things came to him in that night, the demons and the feeling of hopelessness. So if what you really want out of this path is unconditional happiness, and I want that for you, you have to somehow be able to let go of the conditions. All of them, right? Unconditional. So all of them. So you have to turn and face this story. Life is only worth living with X, whatever it is. And that story is only made of sounds in the head, pictures in the head, and feelings in the body. Can you feel them now? I'm already pointing you toward it. Even if you don't have a trapped feeling in your life, you can start to feel into that part of you that I'm saying, what if that thing you think is necessary for life to be worth living was taken away? What gets activated in the body? The feelings in the body, sounds in the mind, pictures in the mind. As you start to work with this, and you will first be facing fear for most people. But then grief will come along as well, because this story about life would not be worth living without is a story of love. I love this about life, and I love myself, and I want myself to have this thing I love. It's a beautiful story. It's driven by love for yourself and love for some aspect of the world. So if you're feeling trapped and don't have access to this, there will be tremendous grief. Because the love's heart will be broken. Because the love is not a unconditional love, it is a conditional love. And then we have to feel that grief. But that grief is only feelings in the body, sounds in the mind, and pictures in the mind. So what's on the other side of this fear and grief? Well, the other side of this fear and grief is unconditional happiness. It's an experience of, this is exactly, Nietzsche has a story called, well, it's often referred to as eternal return. And he says, imagine that you had to live your exact life over and over again, exactly the same way. You die and then you immediately start living the same life, exactly the same way again. And at first he says, doesn't that sound like hell, right? Because you're trapped in the exact same life over and over again. But then he says, are there any moments in your life where someone told you you would be living it over and over again for eternity, that you would go, thank you, that is the greatest blessing? Those moments are the taste of what we are practicing. When you are in the steel room and you go, I love this steel room exactly as it is. I love this feeling in my body while I'm in this steel room. I love because I am love. because I am nothing but love for whatever is arising. And whatever is arising is rich beyond compare. The mind can make shallow whatever is happening. I actually was in a movie where I'm trapped in a single room. And it's a movie. Most people don't mind. It's not a horrible movie, right? It's a pretty good movie. People don't mind sitting there watching that movie with a person trapped in a room. Because if you're willing to open to what, obviously that's a movie with designed to be dramatic and everything. But the truth is, if you're open to the present moment, it's rich beyond compare, no matter what the mind's narrative about the present moment is. And usually that's very easy to see. You can just look, and there's just colors that you could, more than you could count, and feelings and sounds. And it's all alive, vibrating and changing and flowing. The only way to see that is to see through the story, right? To see through the story. So, extreme suffering can make practice almost impossible, but it can also be an opportunity to really move beyond. I certainly don't wish I wish lack of suffering to all of you, but that really can only be wished for you if I'm wishing acceptance for you. Because the way we are structured is we will find suffering in our experience, no matter how good it's structured, unless we really practice acceptance. Now, the truth is that in life, most of the time, if you can really face your feeling of trappedness, you will actually be in the best position to find a way out of the narrative circumstances of being trapped. When we feel trapped, it's really hard for us to see opportunities to get free. Because the feeling of trapped makes you keep seeing the walls. Right? If you're having an experience of feeling trapped, then you're having an experience of there being walls that you can't get over. And that guides your eyes. It guides your mind. It makes you repeatedly come back to the obstacles rather than the way through. And for most of us, this is not true of all things. Some of us get terminally ill. Some of us get, like, there are circumstances we cannot avoid in life, of course. But for most of us, most of the time we feel trapped. The ability to see through that feeling allows us to suddenly see the full richness of the present moment. And that allows us to see all sorts of opportunities and ways through that we would not otherwise have been willing to look at. The fear and grief that is stopping us from being able to move through and out of our trapped space get healed. And the sense of being closed in evaporates. I didn't tell the story this way from the beginning because ultimately the way through requires you to fully accept this feeling of being trapped. If you're only trying to accept the feeling of being trapped to get out of the steel room, you won't accept the feeling of being trapped because you're trying to get rid of the feeling of being trapped. There's a lot of lessons in here for our practice, and I'm making it very dramatic, but it applies in a very small way. When you're trying to be mindful of your suffering, your sadness, in order to get rid of your sadness, then the sadness will not heal. Not completely. So we have to face the core of our feelings at some point for them to heal. Not aggressively, not in a mode to battle them. We have to face them, embrace them. Ah, that rhymes. Good. We've got a slogan: face and embrace. Okay, let's sit.